Hello, it's Dr. Reba. I realize it's been quite some time since I've posted anything to Instagram, but given the current circumstances, I thought that it was important to come on and share a bit of really critical information. I realize the past several days have been pretty challenging for a lot of us, and a lot of us may be starting to feel a bit stir crazy with being indoors. And in all likelihood, we will need to keep this up for the next several weeks, if not several months, in order to really help contain this. Um, Now, some of us may not fully understand the need for these precautions, and for those of us who may not fully understand, I do want to share some really interesting information to help kind of put things into perspective. So this is epidemiological data from the Imperial College in London. Um, and what they did was, so the epidemiologists and statisticians there did a few epidemiological models. So they modeled what would happen in three different scenarios. So in the first scenario, we do nothing. So we don't quarantine people who are positive with the virus. We don't implement any physical distancing practices. We pretty much just allow the virus to run its course. And what happens in this situation is about 80% of Americans ultimately end up contracting the virus. And of that 80% who do get the virus, about 1% of them will eventually lose their lives. So this is about 2.2 million Americans who would die from the virus by itself. Now, this is assuming that everyone who does have the virus does have access to adequate medical support. So because the virus does attack the lungs, people who are most severely impacted do need ventilator support to help them breathe. Now, in a situation where the disease is sort of allowed to run rampant, the available supply of ventilators wouldn't come anywhere near meeting the actual need. So for every 30 people who have need for a ventilator, just one would be available. So accounting for that, the death toll would be closer to 4 million Americans. So this is the entire city of Los Angeles gone within a span of just 3 months. And if you extrapolate that, those numbers globally, the death toll reaches about 90 million people. Now, in the second situation, people who are positive with the virus are quarantined, and people who have had any contact with a known carrier of the virus is also quarantined. So this is kind of what we saw in the early days of the pandemic. Now, in addition to quarantining, the people who are most vulnerable are also asked to self-isolate. So people who are elderly, people who are immunocompromised, people with chronic diseases, those people are asked to kind of physically distance themselves from the rest of the population. And what happens in this instance is the burden on the healthcare system is reduced, but the demand for ventilator support still significantly outpaces the actual supply. So for every 8 people that needs ventilator support, just one would be available. So ultimately, in this situation, about 1.1 million Americans will eventually lose their lives. Now, in the third scenario, in addition to quarantining, in addition to physically distancing people who are the most vulnerable, the entire population is asked to socially distance. So non-essential businesses are shut down. People really are don't leave their homes unless absolutely necessary. And when they do leave their homes, they're very careful to kind of adhere to that 6-foot physical distancing between themselves and other people. And what happens in this scenario is that it works. So the supply of necessary medical equipment, so ventilators, meets the demand, or at least comes very close to meeting demand. And the death toll is a few thousand people rather than a few million people. So these next few weeks are really going to be critical, because this is the time where we are able to flatten that curve, so that the healthcare isn't overwhelmed and overburdened, by a large number of people, um, who are in need of intensive medical support. So we all have the potential to save millions of lives, and all we have to do is stay home. Um, so please, I really beg of you to take this seriously, and do your part. We can beat this, but we have to do it together. Be well, and God bless.